The man who would be arrested before noon came up the forecourt at 10:30 with the walk of someone who owned the stones. I had stood the Kingsmere gate of Harborne Court for 9 years by then, and I had learned to read a man long before he reached the rope. You learn it the way you learn weather. Not by the face, faces lie, and lie best when they smile, but by the hands and the feet and the small space a man keeps around himself. This one kept a great deal of space. He came through the morning crowd of tourists the way a yacht comes through dinghies, and the crowd parted for him without being asked, because he carried himself as a man accustomed to being parted for. Pearl gray coat, cut close. A silver-headed cane he did not need, swinging it like punctuation. A flower in the buttonhole, a fresh one, a white carnation, which meant he had stopped at a stall that morning and chosen it, which meant he had thought about how he would look coming up this particular forecourt on this particular day. I was the second sentry. The first was a boy named Wicket, 11 weeks on the gate, 20 years old, standing his post on the south face with the stillness of a man holding his breath underwater. My place was the inner line, 3 paces back and to his right, where I could see the whole sweep of the forecourt and the rope and the faces beyond it. That is the job most days. You are not a statue. You are a pair of eyes that has learned to look like a statue, and the looking is the whole of the work. So I was looking when the gray coat came up, and something in me went quiet and cold the way it does. I did not know him. That is the thing I want to be plain about, because afterward people made it into a kind of magic, and it was not magic. I did not know his name. I had never seen his face. But I had seen his shape, in a manner of speaking, 3 weeks before, standing at this same rope, in the trembling hands of an old woman who had come to the gate, because she did not know where else in the city to go. Her name was Mrs. Harlow. She had come up the forecourt one wet Tuesday and stood at the rope and waited, in the patient, hopeless way of people who have been told all their lives that this is not a place where you can simply ask for help, and asked it anyway because everywhere else had shut its door. I had been on the inner line that day too. When the morning thinned out I had stepped to the rope, which we may do briefly, to move a person along or answer a question, and I had asked if she was lost. She was not lost. She was robbed. Not at knife point she would have known what to do about a knife. She had been robbed by a gentleman. He had a name, she said, though she suspected now it was not his. He had manners. He had a card, cream-colored, with a crest on it that she had taken for a real crest, and that was, she had since learned, a real crest belonging to a family that had died out 100 years ago, and that anyone might therefore print. He had spoken of a fund. A private fund, he said, for the relief of the widows of old soldiers, administered very quietly, you understand, by certain persons close to the household. He had nodded when he said that, in the direction of the very gate I stood, for the widows of men who had served and left their wives with too much pride to ask for charity and too little to live on. He had found her, he said, the way the fund found all its beneficiaries, discreetly, through a clergyman, through a word in the right ear. She need only contribute a small administrative sum, you see, against the much larger sum the fund would settle on her, the law being what it is about these things. She had given him £400. It was, she told me, with her chin up and her eyes wet and steady, the whole of what her husband had left her that was not the roof over her head. She had given it to him in an envelope on a bench in the public gardens, and he had pressed her hand and told her she was the sort of woman the fund existed for, and she had walked home feeling, for the first time in the 3 years since she buried her sergeant, that the country he had served had not entirely forgotten her. There was no fund. There was no clergyman who would own to the word in the right ear. There was no settlement. There was a cream card with a dead family's crest, and an address that turned out to be a tobacconist's that took letters for £1 a week, and a man who had pressed her hand on a bench and then simply ceased, as such men do, to exist. I am a soldier. I am not a constable, and the gate is not a court, and there was nothing in that wet Tuesday I could do for Mrs. Harlow but what I did, which was to take her, when I came off my watch, to the duty sergeant, and from the duty sergeant to the constabulary office on Marrow Street, and to stand beside her while she said it all again to a kind, tired inspector named Pell who wrote it down and did not, I could see, expect to recover a penny of it. These men move on. They are smoke. By the time the ink dries, they are 3 cities away with a new card, and a new crest, and a new fund. But before she left the gate that day, Mrs. Harlow had done one thing more, and it is the reason this story has an end worth telling. She had described him. Not the way most people describe a man, tall, well-dressed. You know the sort. She had been a sergeant's wife for 40 years, and she described him the way a soldier's wife learns to describe things, in details that do not change when a man changes his coat. The silver-headed cane he did not lean on. The white flower he wore fresh each day, because, she said, he had told her once, laughing, that a man is never suspected who takes the trouble to look like he has nothing to hide. The little habit he had of turning a signet ring on his smallest finger when he was about to ask you for something. And the voice, a beautiful voice, she said, a voice that made you feel he was letting you in on a secret, and underneath the beauty of it, if you listened, which she had not until it was too late, a flatness, a coldness. The voice of a man reading lines he has read 1,000 times and finds, privately, a little dull. I wrote it down. Not officially, Pell had the official account. I wrote it in the small black book every sentry of the Kingsmere gate keeps and is not strictly required to, the one where we note the things that do not fit into the watch log, the loiterer who came back 3 days running, the car that idled too long, the face we did not like the look of. I wrote, gray coat, silver cane unused, fresh white flower daily, turns a signet on the little finger when he wants something, fine voice gone flat underneath. And I wrote because Mrs. Harlow had said it last of all with her hand on the rope. He told me he likes to choose marks near the palace because no one robbed near the king's own gate ever believes they have been robbed. The gate makes them feel safe. That is what he uses. That is the whole of his trick. 3 weeks later, at 10:30 on a bright cold morning, a man in a gray coat came up the forecourt swinging a silver-headed cane he did not lean on, with a fresh white flower in his buttonhole, and stopped at the rope to admire the boy on the south face, and turned idly, the signet ring on his smallest finger. I did not move. That is the first thing I want you to understand, because everything that followed depended on it. A lesser man, a younger man, the man I had been at Wicket's age, would have felt the jolt of recognition go straight to his feet, would have stiffened, would have looked. And the looking would have warned him. A man like that lives by reading the people who read him. It is the only honest skill he has. If I had so much as let my eyes settle a half-second too long on the white flower, he would have felt it the way you feel a draft from an open door behind you. And he would have made some pleasant remark and drifted off down the forecourt and into the crowd and out of the city. And Mrs. Harlow's £400, and the £400 of all the others I did not yet know about, would have gone with him. So I looked at nothing. I looked as I always look, at the whole and not the part. I let my gaze pass over him the way it passed over the German family photographing the lamp standard and the 2 students eating chips from a paper and the woman with the pram, and I kept it moving, and I felt him decide that the inner sentry, the older one, the one 3 paces back, was furniture, was scenery, was, in fact, the very best kind of audience a man like him could ask for, a man trained not to react, in a uniform that was the symbol of the safety he intended to sell. He had come, I understood, to work. He took his time. That was the mark of him, the thing that lifted him above the common run of cheats, the patience. A pickpocket is in and out in a breath. This man set up shop. He leaned his forearms on the very rope I was sworn to keep, in the easy way of a man who has decided to enjoy the view, and he began, in that beautiful flat voice, to talk to the people around him about the boy on the south face. "Marvelous, isn't he?" he said to no one and to everyone. "Look at the discipline of it, not a flicker." A few tourists turned, glad of a confident Englishman to tell them what they were seeing. He had an audience in moments. He gathered them the way I had seen Mrs. Harlow describe without seeming to reach for them at all. "I'll tell you a thing most people don't know," he said, lowering his voice just enough that they had to lean in, which is the oldest trick there is. "These men aren't only for show. Half of them have come straight out of the regiments. Decorated, some of them. There's one fellow on this gate, I shan't say which." And here, God help him, he tipped his silver cane a half-inch in the direction of young Wicket, who had been 11 weeks a soldier and had decorated nothing but a parade square, who I happen to know did remarkable things overseas. Remarkable. You'd never get him to speak of it. That's the breed. It was very well done. I will give him that, across all the years between, as a craftsman gives a thief his due. It was beautifully done. He was building the gate up in their minds, the honor of it, the depth of it, the unimpeachable safety of it. And he was doing it so that when, in a few minutes, he turned the talk gently round to a private fund, administered very quietly, you understand, by certain persons close to the household, for the relief of soldiers fallen on hard times, the listening tourists would already have it fixed in their heads that this gate, and the men of it, and anything spoken of in their shadow, was as solid as the stone. He was using us. He was standing at the king's own gate and using the gate itself as the lie. That is the part I have never quite forgiven, and the part, I think, that made what came after feel less like duty and more like something owed. A young couple had stopped to listen, Americans, by their shoes and their open, friendly faces. Honeymooners, I would have guessed, the sort who save for years for a fortnight and want, very much, to come home with a story about the real England they had been let into. The man in gray turned the warmth of his voice on them like a lamp. He was sorry, he said, to have been holding forth. He did so love this place. He came most mornings when he could, because a man in his position, and here he did not quite say what his position was, which made it grander than any position he could have named, found it a comfort to stand a while near so much steadiness. The young wife said something kind. He turned the signet ring on his little finger. And I, 3 paces back on the inner line, with my eyes on the whole forecourt and not the part, began the only fight I was permitted to fight, which was the fight to do absolutely nothing perfectly until the moment to do something arrived. Understand what I could not do. I could not cross the rope and take him by the collar. He had robbed no one in front of me. He had, at that moment, broken no law a magistrate would hear of. Leaning on a rope and telling tales is not a crime, and a soldier of the household who lays hands on a member of the public for the look of him is finished, and worse, useless, because the man would walk free and warned, and there is no warned man harder to catch than the one who has watched you fail to catch him once. I could not even be sure. I was a sentry with a dead woman's husband's pension in my chest and an old woman's careful list in a black book, looking at a gray coat and a white flower and a silver cane. Likely is not proof. The whole of the discipline of my trade, the thing the tourists mistake for stillness, is the knowing of that line, between the thing you are sure of in your blood and the thing you can stand up in a court and swear to. I was sure of him in my blood. I had nothing I could swear to. Not yet. What I had was the gate. And the gate, it turned out, was everything. Because the man's whole genius, the thing Mrs. Harlow had handed me, last of all, with her hand on the rope, was that he chose to work near the palace so that his marks would feel safe. He had built his entire trade on the king's own gate, making people trust him. He had come here this morning to use our steadiness as the backdrop to his lie. And it had not once occurred to him, because such men cannot imagine it, that the steadiness was real, that it was not scenery, that the furniture was watching, that the very gate he was leaning on, the very safety he was selling, would be the thing that closed around him, not with a shout, not with a rush, but slowly, quietly, the way a tide comes in around a man who has been told the water and has not believed it. I needed 3 things, and I needed them without the gray coat feeling the draft. I needed time to keep him here on this ground, long enough for the second 2 things to arrive. I needed the law, a constable, and better than a constable, Inspector Pell of Marrow Street, who had Mrs. Harlow's account in his own hand and would know the white flower for what it was the moment I named it. And I needed a witness. He could not charm and could not edit and could not later call a misunderstanding. The gates own quiet machinery, the things that do not change their story. The first I could buy myself. The other two I had to send for, and sending from a post you may not leave, with a man 6 feet away who reads people for his living, is a thing they do not teach you in the first year, nor the second. They teach it to you the way they teach everything that matters, by trusting you, one day, with a gate and walking away, and leaving you to find out whether the years went in. There is a signal. I will not tell you the whole of it because it is still ours and still in use, but I will tell you this much, because it is the heart of how a still man calls for help without moving. It lives in the relief. The KingsGuard gate is changed on a fixed pattern the public has watched 10,000 times and never once learned to read, and woven through that pattern, invisible inside a thing everyone has seen, are the small variations a sentry may make, a half-beat held, a position of the rifle, an order to the guardroom passed up the line as the change is dressed. That say, to the men who can read them and to no one else, trouble at the rope, no haste, send quietly. It is built to be invisible precisely to a man like the one in gray, who watches everything and has trained himself to see only what people mean him to see. He was watching the boy. He was watching the honeymooners drink him in. He was not watching the furniture. And the furniture, at 11 minutes to 11, when the relief came on as it comes on every hour of every day, said what it needed to say in a language he had been admiring for 20 minutes and could not read a word of. Then I had to keep him. And to keep a man like that, a patient, clever, restless man who could feel a morning souring and would drift off the moment the work went cold, I had to do the single hardest thing the gate had ever asked of me. I had to give him exactly what he wanted. I had to let the statue speak. A sentry of the inner line may speak to the public. People do not know this, and it surprises them when it happens, which is exactly why it works. We are not under the same order of silence as the man on the face. The boy on the south face would no more open his mouth at his post than fall over, but the second man, the watcher, may step to the rope and move a person along, answer a child, warn a fool back from the gravel a horse is about to cross. It is rare. We hoard it. A word from the still man lands with 10 times the weight of a word from anyone else, precisely because he gives so few. And I had decided, in the cold quiet behind my own face, that I would spend one of those words to buy the 400 pounds of every Mrs. Harlow this man had not yet found. I stepped to the rope. I did it the way we are taught to do everything, without haste, without drama, a slow square turn and 3 measured paces, so that to the watching crowd it read as nothing more than a guardsman attending to his line. But the gray coat felt it. Of course he felt it. The furniture had moved, and a man who lives by the movements of furniture went very still inside his easy posture, and his eyes came to me, bright and quick and delighted, because the one thing better than using a KingsGuard as the backdrop to your lie is having the KingsGuard actually speak. Sir, I said, only that to begin, level, unhurried, the voice we use which gives nothing. He speaks. The gray coat turned the full lamp of his charm on me and on the dozen people now watching, spreading his arms a little as if he had personally coaxed a marvel into being. Ladies and gentlemen, you are privileged. They scarcely ever, sir, you do us great honor. I was just telling these good people what fine men you are. I heard you, sir. I let a beat sit on it. You were speaking of a fund. I watched it land. I will remember the half-second of it as long as I live, because it is the only crack I ever saw in him, and it was the width of a hair, and it closed as fast as it opened. A man who is purely a liar would have shown nothing. But this man was a craftsman, and a craftsman, hearing his own work named back to him from a mouth he had not expected to hear it from, feels the briefest flush of a thing close to pride, and under the pride, a tiny cold tightening, the question every cheat carries folded in his breast pocket. How much does this one know? It crossed his face and was gone. He laughed, warm and full. You have sharp ears for a man who stands so still. Yes, a small charity, a private thing, for the widows and the broken-down old soldiers of our wars. Administered very quietly, you understand. He said it to me, but he said it for them, the honeymooners, the listening crowd. He was using me now, building me into the proof. See, the guard himself knows of it. The guard himself takes it seriously. And he had no idea, none, that I had stepped to the rope for the sole purpose of being so used, of holding him here on this ground with the bait of my own attention, while the language he could not read carried up the line and out the gate and toward Marrow Street. A worthy thing, I said, for old soldiers. The worthiest. You'd know, I dare say, better than any man here what becomes of them, the forgetting of them. It is the great scandal of a grateful nation, sir, that we cheer the regiments down the Mall and let their widows go cold. He had warmed all the way up now. This was his sermon, and he believed it the way a good liar believes the part of the lie that is true. I do what one small man can, discreetly, through the right people. The signet ring turned on his little finger. I don't suppose, he said, and here it came, the reaching, gentle as a hand laid on a sleeve. I don't suppose a man like yourself might know of any case. A brother soldier left in hard straits. A widow too proud to ask. The fund exists for exactly such, and a word from a man of your standing would carry weight where mine might not. And there it was, laid out on the rope between us in the morning light, the whole of him. He had come to the gate to use our honor, and now he was asking the gate itself to hand him fresh marks, to point him, in our own voices, at the next Mrs. Harlow. He wanted me to give him a widow. I have stood that gate through provocations of every kind. I have been shouted at, spat near, mocked, filmed, dared, shoved. Wicked on the south face would be shoved before the year was out, by a drunk who learned what a rope is for. None of it ever cost me what that question cost me, the smiling, reasonable question, the cane swinging gently, the white flower fresh. I have never in my life wanted so badly to break a man's nose, and I did not move a muscle of my face, because the wanting is not the work. The work is the not doing, and the not doing was the only thing in the world keeping him standing on the ground where I needed him to stand. I might know of a case, I said. The young husband, the honeymooner, had drifted nearer, his open, friendly face turned up between us, his wife's hand in his other hand. I saw it, I see it still, already moving, slow and unthinking, toward the inner pocket of his coat, toward his wallet. He had heard a guardsman vouch for a charity at the King's Gate, and his good American heart had gone out to the widows of England, and he was, in the next 30 seconds, going to ask the gray coat how a person might contribute. I turned my head just slightly and looked at the boy, at the honeymooner. Sir, I said to him quietly, the way you speak to a man near a thing he doesn't know is hot. Keep your hand from your pocket on this forecourt. There are dips in any crowd. It was true, and it was nothing, and it was everything. It broke the spell of the moment. It put the young man's hand back at his side. It turned his open face from the gray coat to me, and it told the gray coat, in words a magistrate could never object to, that the furniture was awake and watching and was not going to let him take this one. His eyes flicked to me, the crack again there and gone. He understood, I think, in that instant that something had changed and could not place it, the way a man feels the temperature drop before he sees the cloud. He straightened off the rope. Well, he said, easy as ever, the cane coming up. I've held you all far too long. I really must. And from the gatehouse arch behind me, unhurried, in no particular hurry at all, came the sound of boots on stone. 2 sets. The first was Sergeant Dunmore, who had stood this gate before I was born and would stand it after I was dust, and who came up the forecourt at the walk we all keep in a crowd, never run. Running starts a panic, and a panic is the cover such men pray for. The second set of boots belonged to a square gray man in an ordinary overcoat with an ordinary face, the most forgettable man on the forecourt, more forgettable by a mile than the gray coat with its silver cane, and that forgettableness was 30 years of his own hard-won craft. Inspector Pell of Marrow Street had been at his desk 4 streets away when the word went quietly out, and he had walked, not run, because he too knew what running does, and he had come through our gatehouse on the strength of a single sentence passed to him by a constable. The white flower is at the Kingsmere rope. The gray coat did not know either of them. Why would he? To him they were a soldier and a nobody, 2 more pieces of the furniture, and his whole face was already rearranging itself into the easy, regretful smile of a busy gentleman taking his leave. He had decided the morning had gone a little flat and it was time to be elsewhere. He turned, cane swinging, to go. "Sir," said Sergeant Dunmore, "a word if you'd be so good." And he said it so pleasantly, so much like a request, that the gray coat, who could no more resist a stage than a moth a lamp, turned back to give the soldier his moment. What happened then took perhaps 4 minutes, and not one of those minutes was loud. I want to set that down plainly because I know the shape of the story people wanted afterward, the shape the gate stories always get bent into. The villain seized, the cuffs, the crowd's gasp, the guard's grim triumph. It was nothing of the kind. It was the quietest arrest you will ever hear described, and it was quiet because quiet was the whole of the point. The man's entire power was the picture he made, the gentleman, the carnation, the gate at his back. Take away the picture and you take away the man. So we did not break the picture with force. We dismantled it, piece by piece, in front of the very crowd he had gathered to admire it, and we did it so gently that he was halfway undone before he understood that anything was happening at all. "I'm afraid I'm rather pressed," the gray coat said to the inspector, who had stepped up beside the sergeant. "Is there?" "Lovely flower," said Pell, mild as milk. "Carnation. You wear one every day, I'm told, fresh." He let that sit. "Funny, a lady told me about that flower 3 weeks ago, described it just so. Said the gentleman who took her money wore a fresh white one every day. On account of a man who looks like he's nothing to hide, never gets asked what he's hiding." The cane stopped swinging. It is a small thing, a cane going still. The crowd did not see it. The honeymooners did not see it, but I saw it, and Pell saw it, and the gray coat knew we saw it, and in that stillness the temperature of the whole forecourt changed. He recovered, I will give him that, to the last. He was a craftsman to the last, and the smile came back broader, with a little laugh under it. "I'm sure I don't know what lady you mean. There must be a great many men in this city who turn a signet ring on your little finger when you're about to ask for something," said Pell. "She told me that too. 40 years a sergeant's wife. She watched you the way a soldier's wife watches a thing. She gave you £400 on a bench, Mr. Well, we'll come to the name. Names are the cheap part with you, I expect." A different man would have run. He was too clever to run. Running on this forecourt with a guardsman at the rope and the gate at his back was the one move that ended in the gravel. He did the cleverer thing, the thing that had carried him across a dozen cities. He appealed to the crowd. He turned that beautiful flat voice up to its full warmth and spread his hands and said, "To the honeymooners, to the German family, to the students with their chips, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you can see what's happening here. A case of mistaken identity, and rather a heavy-handed one in front of all these good people. I'm happy to clear it up at any station this officer likes." He turned to the inspector, wounded, dignified, generous in his patience. "Lead on. I've nothing in the world to hide." And the crowd, God love them, began to murmur for him. You could feel it. Here was a charming Englishman in a fine coat being set upon by a plainclothes nobody and a sergeant and a silent, grim soldier, and the crowd's sympathy, which is a current like any other, began to swing toward the carnation. He felt it swing. He fed on it. For one moment the picture held, and the picture was winning, and I understood that we were about to watch him walk to a station, and from the station, on bail, into the smoke. 3 cities away by the week's end with a new card and a new crest. It was the moment the whole thing turned on, and it did not turn on the law or the inspector or the sergeant. It turned on the gate. I told you I had needed 3 things, and that the third was a witness he could not charm and could not edit and could not call a misunderstanding. I had thought, when I sent the signal, that the witness would be the law itself, Pell's careful account, Mrs. Harlowe's careful list. But the gate, it turned out, had a better one, and it had been standing on the forecourt the whole time, and I had walked past it 10,000 mornings without once thinking what it was for. Above the Kingsmere arch, set into the old stone where the lamp standard meets the gatehouse, there is a camera. There are several. They have watched that forecourt without blinking for longer than I have stood beneath them. They do not gather sympathy, and they cannot be charmed, and a fresh white flower means nothing to them at all. And in the gatehouse, where the duty constable sits, there is a screen, and the morning's watch runs onto a roll that the household keeps, because a king's gate is the most watched 4 yards of stone in the kingdom and always has been. The gray coat had built his whole trade on the gate making people feel safe. He had never once asked himself what makes a gate safe. It is not the picture, it is the watching. He had come to perform in front of the most patient, most unblinking, most uncharmable audience in the city, and he had performed for 22 minutes leaning on the rope, gathering his crowd, naming his fund, turning his ring, reaching for the honeymooner's pocket through me, under a lens that does not forget and cannot be edited and would, within the hour, sit on Inspector Pell's table beside Mrs. Harlowe's account and a dozen others like it. Pell did not even raise his voice. He simply said, into the swinging current of the crowd's sympathy, in his mild gray way, "There's a camera over the arch, sir. Been running all morning. Got the whole of your charity sermon on it. I should think the fund, the ring, the lot. We'll lay it beside the lady's statement and the others. There's more than the one lady, you understand. There's been a queue forming at Marrow Street for a fortnight, all of them describing the same flower." He let that land. Then, gentler, almost kind, "You chose this gate because it made them trust you. You never thought the gate was actually watching." And the picture broke. It did not break with a cry or a struggle. It broke the way ice breaks, all at once and silently, a thing that was solid becoming a thing that was only ever a surface. The crowd's murmur, which had been swinging toward the carnation, stopped and reversed, and went cold, as the honeymooner's wife drew her husband's hand back from where it had crept again toward his pocket, and the German father gathered his children a step nearer, and the students lowered their chips and looked, for the first time, at the gray coat the way you look at a thing you have just understood. They had been about to be his crowd. Now they were ours, not by force, not by a shout, but because the truth had been set down in front of them plainly and they had eyes. The gray coat looked at the camera over the arch. He looked at me. And for the first and only time, the beautiful flat voice failed him. He found nothing to say, because there was nothing to say, because the one thing a man like him cannot do is talk his way past a witness with no ears to charm and no heart to move. He had spent his life learning to read people, and he had walked into the one place in the kingdom where the people are watched by something that is not a person at all, and he had not seen it, because such men cannot imagine being watched without being admired. Mr. Lucian Ashbourne, said Pell, for that, it would turn out, was one of his names, the one the goldsmith's ledger and the tobacconist's letter book, and the bank that cashed the widow's envelope would settle on. "I'm arresting you on suspicion of obtaining property by deception." You don't have to say anything, but I'd take it as a kindness if you didn't, because I've heard enough fine voices for one morning. He did not resist. They never do, the clever ones, once the picture is gone. Resistance is for men who still think they can win, and he knew, with the cold, quick intelligence that was the only real thing about him, that he had already lost the only fight that mattered, which had ended not when the inspector named him but 20 minutes earlier, when a still man at a rope had looked at nothing, and decided to do absolutely nothing perfectly, until the moment came. Sergeant Dunmore stepped aside to let the inspector and the constable take him, and the gray coat went between them down the forecourt he had come up so grandly, and he did not swing the cane now. A constable carried it. The white flower was still fresh in his buttonhole. I have thought about that flower more than I should. He had chosen it that morning in front of his glass to look like a man with nothing to hide, and it rode out of the king's gate on the coat of a man with everything to hide, and it had not protected him at all, because the gate he had used was not, as it turned out, scenery. The forecourt closed over the gap where he had stood the way water closes. The honeymooners stayed a moment, the young husband looking at me with his open, friendly face gone thoughtful, and he came to the rope, keeping his hand from his pocket now, I noticed, and I was glad of it, and he said, "Thank you." I was about to ask him how I could give. And his wife said, more quietly, "We'd have given him everything we had and gone home with a story." And I think she understood, better than her husband did, exactly how close a thing it had been, and exactly what it is that a gate is for. I said the only thing I am permitted to say, which is nothing much, that they should enjoy the rest of their visit and mind the dips in the crowd. They went off down the forecourt into the bright cold morning, and I stepped my 3 measured paces back to the inner line, and I went still again, and the watch ran on, and to every person who came up the rope for the rest of that day I was once more, and gladly, a piece of the furniture. The rest of it happened away from the gate, in the slow, patient places where the real work of justice is done and no one films it. The camera over the arch gave them 22 minutes of him. Mrs. Harlowe's careful list, the cane, the flower, the ring, the flat voice under the warm one, matched a queue of accounts that had been quietly forming at Marrow Street, 11 of them in the end, then 19, then more as the newspapers carried the careful word that a man was being asked about a certain fund. A retired schoolmistress, a war widow younger than Mrs. Harlowe and prouder, a blind piano tuner who had given the gray coat his savings in coins counted by touch. The tobacconist's letter book and the goldsmith's ledger, and the bank that had cashed the widow's envelope drew the lines between them all, and the lines all met at one man with a great many names, and the law, which is slow and unglamorous and does not swing a cane, closed around him exactly as a tide closes, and held. He was tried in the autumn. He was very good in the dock, charming, regretful, generous in his patience with the proceedings, right up until the morning they showed the court the 22 minutes from the arch, and the jury watched him turn his ring and reach, through a still soldier, for a honeymooner's pocket, and the picture broke a second time, in front of 12 people who had eyes. He went to prison for a long time. The money was mostly gone. It always is, but the court ordered back what could be found, and it was not nothing, and Mrs. Harlowe had a portion of her sergeant's £400 returned to her hand in a courtroom by a kind, tired inspector, which she told me, when she came up the forecourt one last time to say so, mattered to her far less than the other thing. The other thing was this. She stood at the rope where she had stood robbed and ashamed 3 weeks before, an old woman who had let herself believe, for one warm afternoon, that her country had not forgotten her and been punished for the believing, and she had come back to tell me that she had got the believing back. "I thought I was a fool," she said, with her chin up and her eyes steady. "I thought I'd been a fool to trust a thing because it stood near this gate." She looked up at the stone, at the arch, at the boy still as a statue on the south face. "Turns out I wasn't wrong about the gate. I was only wrong about the man standing in front of it." And she laid her hand on the rope, the way she had the first day, and she went home, and she did not come back, and I have always taken that for the best kind of ending. The kind where the person you helped no longer needs you and walks off into an ordinary morning made whole. People still ask me how I knew. They want it to be a gift, a guard's uncanny eye, a sixth sense, the magic the gate stories are made of. It was nothing of the kind. I knew because an old woman, robbed and ashamed, had stood at a rope and described a man the way a soldier's wife describes things, in the details that do not change when he changes his coat, and because I had written it down in a small black book, and because I had then done the one thing the trade exists to teach. I had stood still, and watched, and waited, and not let the wanting become the doing until the doing was lawful and certain, and could not come apart in a court. That is the whole of it. The man thought he was safe because he stood near the king's gate. He never once understood that the gate is not a picture you stand in front of to look safe. The gate is a man who does not move and does not speak and does not break, and who is, the entire time you are admiring how still he is, watching you. He thought the stillness was for show. He found out too late, and so did half the city's grief along with him, that the stillness was for him. It always was. It is the most patient thing in the world, and it is waiting, every hour of every quiet morning, for the one man who believes that no one is watching at the king's own gate. And it is never, ever, the scenery he takes it for.